Chapter 2: The Family Myth of Ideology. Numerous treatises have been written about the perception of a historical real in the terms of a family narrative as a fundamental ideological operation, a story about the conflict of larger social forces, classes and so forth, is framed into the coordinates of a family drama. This ideology, of course, finds its clearest expression in Hollywood as the ultimate ideological machine. In a typical Hollywood product, everything, from the fate of the Knights of the Round Table, through the October Revolution, up to asteroids hitting Earth, is transposed into an Oedipal narrative. A Deleuzian cannot resist the temptation of pointing out how the main theoretical justification of such familialization is psychoanalysis, which makes it the key ideological machine. Capitalist realism. Our first step should be to analyze this family narrative at its most elementary, kitsch level. Exemplary here is Michael Crichton, today's successor of Arthur Haley, the first great author of capitalist realism, whose bestsellers back in the 1960s, Hotel, Airport, Cars, always focused on a particular site of production or complex organization, mixing a melodramatic plot with lengthy descriptions of the site's functions, in an unexpected echo of the Stalinist classics of the late 1920s and 30s, such as Gladkov's Cement. Crichton added to the genre a postmodern techno-thriller twist. In accordance with today's predominant politics of fear, he's the ultimate novelist of fear. Fear of the past, Jurassic Park, Eaters of the Dead; of the nanotechnological future, Prey; of Japan's economic strength, The Rising Sun; of sexual harassment, Disclosure; of robotic technology, Westworld; of the medical industry, Coma; of alien intrusions, Andromeda Strain; of ecological catastrophes, State of Fear. State of Fear, his most recent book, brings an unexpected final addition to this series of shadowy forces which lurk among us. Poised to wreak havoc, America's fiercest enemies are none other than the environmentalists themselves. As many a critic has noted, Crichton's books are not really novels. They are more like unfinished drafts, prospectuses for screenplays. However, it is this very feature which makes his work interesting for an analysis of contemporary ideology. The very lack of stylistic qualities, the totally transparent mode of writing, allows the underlying ideological fantasies to be staged at their embarrassingly sublimated purest, in naked form, as it were. Exemplary here is Prey, in which a nanotechnological experiment in a laboratory in the Nevada desert goes horribly wrong. A cloud of nanoparticles, millions of microrobots, escapes. The cloud, visible to observers as a black swarm, is self-sustaining, self-reproducing, intelligent, and it learns from experience, evolving hour by hour. Every effort to destroy it fails. It has been programmed to become a predator. Humans are its prey. Only a handful of scientists trapped in the laboratory can halt the release of this mechanical plague on a defenseless world. As is always the case in such stories, this big plot, the catastrophe that threatens to ruin humanity itself, is combined with the secondary plot, a set of relations and tensions amongst the group of scientists, with the troubled role reversal married couple at its center. Jack, the novel's narrator, was the manager of a cutting-edge computer program division in a media technology company before he was made a scapegoat for someone else's corruption and fired. Now he is a house husband, while his wife Julia is the workaholic vice president of Zymos, the nanotechnology company which owns the Nevada Desert Laboratory where the catastrophe occurs. Erotic, manipulative, and cold, she is a new version of the corporate vixen from Disclosure. At the novel's start, Jack has to cope with their 3 children, discusses Pampers versus Huggies with another father in the supermarket, and tries to control his suspicions that his wife is having an affair. Far from providing a mere human interest subplot, this family plot is what the novel really turns on. The cloud of nanoparticles should be conceived of as a materialization of the family's tensions. The first thing that cannot but strike the eye of anyone who knows Lacan is how this swarm resembles what Lacan, in his Seminar 11, called lamella. It appears indestructible in its infinite plasticity. It always reassembles itself, able to morph into a multitude of shapes. In it, pure evil animality overlaps with machine-like blind insistence. The lamella is an entity consisting of pure surface, without the density of a substance, an infinitely plastic object capable not just of incessantly changing its form, but even of transposing itself from one to another medium. Imagine something that is first heard as a shrill sound, and then pops up as a monstrously distorted body. A lamella is indivisible, indestructible, and immortal. More precisely, undead in the sense this term has in horror fiction. Not sublime spiritual immortality, but the obscene immortality of the living dead, which, after every annihilation, recompose themselves and clumsily carry on their activities. As Lacan puts it, the lamella does not exist. It insists. It is unreal, an entity of pure semblance, a multiplicity of appearances which seem to envelop a central void. Its status is purely phantasmatic. This blind, indestructible insistence of the libido is what Freud called the death drive, and one should bear in mind that the death drive is, paradoxically, the Freudian name for its very opposite, for the way immortality appears within psychoanalysis, for an uncanny excess of life, for an undead urge which persists beyond the biological cycle of life and death, of generation and corruption. Freud equates the death drive with the so-called compulsion to repeat, an uncanny urge to repeat painful past experiences which seem to outgrow the natural limitations of the organism affected by it, and to insist even beyond the organism's death. As such, the lamella is what is subtracted from the living being by virtue of the fact that it is subject to the cycle of sexed reproduction. It precedes sexual difference. It multiplies and reproduces itself by means of asexual self-division. In the novel's climactic scene, Jack holds Julia in his arms while she, unbeknownst to him, is already infected by the swarm and lives in symbiosis with the nanoparticles, receiving from them a superhuman life power. I held her. The skin of her face began to shiver, vibrating rapidly, and then her features seemed to grow, to swell as she screamed. I thought her eyes looked frightened. The swelling continued and began to break up into rivulets and streams. And then, in a sudden rush, Julia literally disintegrated before my eyes. The skin of her swollen face and body blew away from her in streams of particles, like sand blown off a sand dune. The particles curved away in the arc of the magnetic field towards the side of the room. I felt her body growing lighter and lighter in my arms. Still the particles continued to flow away with a kind of whooshing sound to all corners of the room. And when it was finished, what was left behind, what I still held in my arms, was a pale and cadaverous form. Julia's eyes were sunk deep in her cheeks. Her mouth was thin and cracked, her skin translucent. Her hair was colorless, brittle. Her collarbones protruded from her bony neck. She looked like she was dying of cancer. Her mouth worked. I heard faint words, hardly more than breathing. I leaned in, turned my ear to her mouth to hear. "Jack," she whispered. "It's eating me." This separation is then undone. The particles return to Julia and revitalize her. The particles on the wall were drifting free once more. Now they seemed to telescope back, returning to her face and body. And suddenly, in a whoosh, all the particles returned, and Julia was full and beautiful and strong as before, and she pushed me away from her with a contemptuous look. In the final confrontation, we then get both Julias side by side, the glimmering Julia composed of the swarm and the exhausted real Julia. Julia came swirling up through the air toward me, spiraling like a corkscrew, and grabbed the ladder alongside me. Except she wasn't Julia, she was the swarm, and for a moment the swarm was disorganized enough that I could see right through her in places. I could see the swirling particles that composed her. I looked down and saw the real Julia, deathly pale, standing and looking up at me, her face a skull. By now the swarm alongside me became solid-looking, as I had seen it become solid before. It looked like Julia. Here we are not talking about science, not even problematic science, but one of the fundamental fantasy scenarii, or more precisely, the scenario of the very disintegration of the link between fantasy and reality, so that we get the two of them, fantasy and reality, the Julia swarm and the real Julia, side by side, as in the wonderful scene from the beginning of Terry Gilliam's Brazil, where food is served in an expensive restaurant in such a way that we get on a plate itself a small patty-like cake, which looks and probably tastes like excrement, while above the plate hangs a color photo which shows us what we are really eating, namely a nicely cooked, juicy steak. This, then, is how one should read Prey. All the pseudo-scientific speculations about nanotechnology are here a pretext to tell the story of a husband reduced to a domestic role, frustrated by his ambitious corporate vixen of a wife. No wonder that, at the novel's end, a normal couple is recreated. At Jack's side is May, the passive but understanding Chinese colleague scientist, silent and faithful, lacking Julia's aggressiveness and ambition. The production of the couple in Hollywood. A variant of the same motif, the impasse of paternal authority and its restoration, secretly runs through all key Steven Spielberg films: E.T., Empire of the Sun, Jurassic Park, Schindler's List. One should remember that the small boy to whom E.T. appears was abandoned by his father, as we learn in the very beginning, so that E.T. is ultimately a kind of vanishing mediator who provides a new father. The good scientist who, in the film's last shot, is already seen embracing the mother. When the new father arrives, E.T. can leave and go home. Empire of the Sun focuses on a boy deserted by his family in war-torn China and surviving through the help of an ersatz father, played by John Malkovich. In the very first scene of Jurassic Park, we see the paternal figure, played by Sam Neill, jokingly threatening the two kids with a dinosaur bone. This bone is clearly the tiny object stain which, later, explodes into gigantic dinosaurs, so that one can risk the hypothesis that, within the film's phantasmatic universe, the dinosaur's destructive fury merely materializes the rage of the paternal superego. A barely perceptible detail that occurs later, in the middle of the film, confirms this reading. Neil and the two children, pursued by the monsters, take refuge from the murderous carnivorous dinosaurs in a gigantic tree, where, dead tired, they fall asleep. On the tree, Neil loses the dinosaur bone that was stuck in his belt, and it is as if this accidental loss has a magical effect. Before they fall asleep, Neil is reconciled with the children, displaying warm affection and tenderness towards them. Significantly, the dinosaurs which approach the tree the next morning and awaken the sleeping party turn out to be of the benevolent, herbivorous kind. Schindler's List is, at its most basic level, a remake of Jurassic Park, and, if anything, worse than the original, with the Nazis as the dinosaur monsters. Schindler as, at the film's beginning, the cynical, profiteering, and opportunistic parental figure, and the ghetto Jews as threatened children. Their infantilization in the film is striking. The story the film tells is about Schindler's gradual rediscovery of his paternal duty towards the Jews, and his transformation into a caring and responsible father. And is The War of the Worlds not the latest installment of this saga? Tom Cruise plays a divorced working-class father who neglects his two children. The invasion of the aliens reawakens in him the proper paternal instincts, and he rediscovers himself as a caring father. No wonder that, in Last Scene, he finally gets the recognition from his son who, throughout the film, despised him. In the mode of 18th century stories, the film could also thus have been subtitled, A Story of How a Working Father is Finally Reconciled with His Son. One can easily imagine the film without the bloodthirsty aliens, so that what remains is in a way what it is really about. The story of a divorced working-class father who strives to regain the respect of his two children. Therein resides the film's ideology, with regard to the two levels of the story: the Oedipal level of lost and regained paternal authority, the spectacular level of the conflict with the invading aliens. There is a clear dissymmetry, since the Oedipal level is what the story is really about, while the external spectacular is merely its metaphoric extension. There is a nice detail in the film's soundtrack, which makes clear the predominance of this Oedipal dimension. The aliens' attacks are accompanied by a terrifying one-note low trombone sound, weirdly resembling the low bass and trumpet sound of the Tibetan Buddhist chant. the voice of the suffering, dying, evil father, in clear contrast to the beautiful 5 tones melodic fragment that identifies the good aliens in Spielberg's Encounters of the Third Kind. No wonder then that the same key discloses the underlying motif of the greatest cinema hit of all times, James Cameron's Titanic. Is Titanic really a film about the catastrophe of a ship hitting an iceberg? One should be attentive to the precise moment of the disaster. It takes place when the 2 young lovers, Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet, immediately after consummating their amorous encounter in the sexual act, return to the ship's deck. This, however, is not all. If this were all, then the catastrophe would have been simply the punishment of fate for the double transgression: illegitimate sexual act, transgression of the class divisions. What is more crucial is that on the deck, Kate passionately tells her lover that when the ship reaches New York the next morning, she will leave with him, preferring a life of poverty with her true love to a false and corrupted existence among the rich. At this moment, the ship hits the iceberg, in order to prevent what would undoubtedly have been the true disaster, namely the couple's life in New York. One can safely guess that the misery of everyday life would soon have destroyed their love. The accident thus occurs in order to save their love, in order to sustain the illusion that, had it not happened, they would have lived happily ever after. But this is not all. A further clue is provided by the final moments of DiCaprio. He is freezing to death in the cold water, while Winslet is safely floating on a large piece of wood. Aware that she is losing him, she cries, "I'll never let you go," all the while pushing him away with her hands. Why? Because he has served his purpose. For beneath the love story, Titanic tells another tale, that of a spoiled high society girl in an identity crisis. She is confused, does not know what to do with herself, and much more than her lover, DiCaprio is a kind of vanishing mediator, whose function is to restore her sense of identity and purpose in life, her self-image. Quite literally, also, he sketches her image. Once his job is done, he can disappear. This is why his last words, before he disappears into the freezing North Atlantic, are not the words of a departing lover, but rather the last message of a preacher, telling her how to lead her life, to be honest and faithful to herself, and so on and so forth. What this means is that Cameron's superficial Hollywood Marxism, his all-too-obvious privileging of the lower classes and caricatural depiction of the cruel egotism and opportunism of the rich, should not deceive us. Beneath this sympathy for the poor, there is another narrative, the profoundly reactionary myth, first fully developed by Kipling's Captains Courageous, of a young rich kid in crisis whose vitality is restored by a brief intimate contact with the full-bodied life of the poor. What lurks behind the compassion for the poor is their vampiric exploitation. The ridiculous climax of this Hollywood procedure of staging great historical events as the backdrop to the formation of a couple is Warren Beatty's Reds, in which Hollywood found a way to rehabilitate the October Revolution itself, arguably the most traumatic historical event of the 20th century. How exactly is the October Revolution depicted in the film? The couple of John Reed and Louise Bryant are in a deep emotional crisis. Their love is reignited when Louise watches John on a platform, delivering an impassioned revolutionary speech. What then follows is their lovemaking, intersected with archetypal scenes from the Revolution, some of which reverberate in all too patent manner with the lovemaking. Say, when John penetrates Louise, there is a cut to a street where a dark crowd of demonstrating people envelops and stops a penetrating phallic tramway. All this against the background of the singing of the Internationale. When, at the orgasmic climax, Lenin himself appears, addressing a packed hall of delegates, he is more a wise teacher overseeing the couple's love initiation than a cold revolutionary leader. Even the October Revolution is acceptable if it serves the reconstitution of a couple. To what extent, one might ask, is this Hollywood formula of the creation of the couple as the foreground of a great historical epic present also in other cultures? Let us take a look at the successes of the October Revolution itself. There are surprises awaiting us here. Take Chiarelli's infamous The Fall of Berlin, 1948, the supreme case of the Stalinist war epic, the story of the Soviet victory over Hitler's Germany. The film begins in 1941, just prior to the German assault on the USSR. A hero, the Stakhanovite steelworker in love with a local teacher, but too shy to directly approach her, is awarded the Stalin Prize and received by Stalin in his dacha. In a scene which was cut after 1953 and then lost after the official congratulations, Stalin notices a nervous uneasiness in the hero and asks him what is wrong. The hero tells Stalin about his love problems, and Stalin gives him advice. Recite poetry to her, that's the way to win a girl's heart, and so on. Back home, the hero succeeds in seducing the girl, but at the very moment when he is carrying her in his arms into the grass, to make love in all probability, the bombs from German planes start to fall. This is June 22nd, 1941. In the ensuing confusion, the girl is taken prisoner by the Germans and taken to a work camp near Berlin, while the hero joins the Red Army, fighting on the front lines to get his love back. At the film's end, when the jubilant crowd of camp prisoners liberated by the Red Army mingles with the Russian soldiers, a plane lands on a field nearby. Stalin himself steps out and walks towards the crowd, which greets him joyfully. At that very point, as if again mediated by Stalin's help, the couple are reunited. The girl notes the hero in the crowd. Before embracing him, she approaches Stalin and asks him if she can give him a kiss. Truly, they don't make them like that anymore. The Fall of Berlin is effectively the story of a couple reunited. World War II serves as the obstacle to be overcome so that the hero can reach his beloved, like the dragon the knight has to kill to win the princess imprisoned in the castle. The role of Stalin is that of a magician and matchmaker who wisely leads the couple to its reunion. The same interpretive key fits science fiction catastrophe films. In a recent example of the series of comic catastrophe films, Mimi Leder's Deep Impact, 1998, a gigantic comet threatens to hit the Earth and to extinguish all life for millennia. At the end of the film, the Earth is saved due to the heroic and suicidal action of a group of astronauts with atomic weapons. Only a small fragment of the comet falls into the ocean east of New York and causes a colossal wave, hundreds of yards high, that flushes the entire northeast coast of the USA, including New York and Washington. This comet thing also creates a couple, but an unexpected one. The incestuous couple of the young, obviously neurotic, sexually inactive TV reporter, Taya Leone, and her promiscuous father, Maximilian Schell, who was divorced her mother and just married a young woman of the same age as his daughter. It is clear that the film is effectively a drama about this unresolved proto-incestuous father-daughter relationship. The threatening comet obviously gives body to the self-destructive rage of the heroine, who is single and has an obvious traumatic fixation on her father. Flabbergasted by her father's remarriage, she is unable to come to terms with the fact that he has abandoned her for her peer. The president, played by Morgan Freeman in a politically correct vein, who, in a broadcast to the nation, announces the looming catastrophe, acts as the ideal counterpoint to the obscene real father, as a caring paternal figure, without a noticeable wife, who, significantly, gives her a privileged role at the press conference, allowing her to ask the first questions. The link of the comet with the dark, obscene underside of paternal authority is made clear through the way the heroine gets in touch with the president. In her investigation, she discovers an impending financial scandal, large illegal government spending, connected with L. Her first idea, of course, is that the president himself is involved in a sex scandal, that L refers to his mistress. She then discovers the truth. ELE is a code name for the emergency measures to be taken when an accident that could lead to total extinction of life threatens the Earth, and the government was secretly spending funds building a gigantic underground shelter in which 1 million Americans would be able to survive the catastrophe. The approaching comet is thus clearly a metaphoric substitute for paternal infidelity, for the libidinal catastrophe of a daughter facing the fact that her obscene father has chosen another young woman over her. The entire machinery of the global disaster is thus set in motion so that the father's young wife will abandon him, and the father will return, not to his wife, the heroine's mother, but to his daughter. The culmination of the film is the scene in which the heroine rejoins her father, who, alone in his luxurious seaside home, awaits the impending wave. She finds him walking along the shoreline. They make peace with each other and embrace, silently awaiting the wave. When the wave approaches and is already casting its large shadow over them, she draws herself closer to her father, gently crying, "Daddy," as if to search for protection in him, reconstituting the childhood scene of a small girl sheltered by the father's loving embrace. And a second later, they are both swept away by the gigantic wave. The heroine's helplessness and vulnerability in this scene should not deceive us. She is the evil spirit who, in the underlying libidinal machinery of the film's narrative, pulls the strings, and this scene of finding death in the protective father's embrace is the realization of her ultimate wish. Here, we are at the opposite extreme to The Forbidden Planet. In both cases, we are dealing with the incestuous relationship between father and daughter. Yet while in Forbidden Planet, the destructive monster materializes the father's incestuous death wish, in Deep Impact, it materializes the daughter's incestuous death wish. The scene on the waterfront with the gigantic wave sweeping away the embraced daughter and father is to be read against the background of the standard Hollywood motif, rendered famous in Fred Zinnemann's From Here to Eternity, of the couple making love on the beach, caressed by waves, Burt Lancaster and Deborah Kerr. Here the couple is truly an incestuous one, so the wave is enormous and destructive, not the soothing ebb and flow of small beach wavelets. Interestingly enough, the other big 1998 blockbuster variation on the theme of a gigantic comet threatening Earth, Armageddon, also focuses on the incestuous father-daughter relationship. Here, however, it is the father, Bruce Willis, who is excessively attached to his daughter. The comet's destructive force gives body to his fury at her love affairs with other men of her own age. Significantly, the denouement is also more positive, not self-destructive. The father sacrifices himself in order to save Earth. That is, effectively, at the level of the underlying libidinal economy, erasing himself in order to bless the marriage of his daughter to her young lover. And out. Rather surprisingly, one often finds a version of the same family myth underlying even the off-Hollywood art films. Let us begin with Florian Henkel von Donnerschmarck's Das Leben der Anderen, The Lives of Others, 2006, often favorably compared with Ulrich Becker's Goodbye Lenin. The claim is that it provides the necessary corrective to Goodbye Lenin, with its sentimental nostalgia, by providing an insight into the manner in which Stasi terror penetrated every pore of private lives. Is, however, this really the case? Upon a closer look, an almost inverted image appears. As in the case with many depictions of the harshness of the communist regimes, The Lives of Others misses the true horror of the situation in its very attempt to portray it. How? First, the trigger for the events in the film is the corrupted Minister of Culture, who wants to get rid of the top GDR playwright, Georg Dreyman, so that he will be able to pursue unimpeded his affair with Dreyman's partner, the actress Christa Maria. In this way, the horror inscribed into the very formal structure of the system is relegated to an effect of a personal whim. The point lost is that, even without the minister's personal corruption, with only dedicated and devoted bureaucrats, the system would be no less terrifying. The writer from whom the minister wants to take the woman is idealized in the opposite manner. If he is such a good writer, both honest and sincerely dedicated to the communist system, personally close to the top regime figures, we learn that Margot Honecker, the party leader's wife, gave him a book by Solzhenitsyn which is strictly prohibited for ordinary people. How is it that he did not come into conflict with the regime much earlier? How is it that he was not considered at least a little bit problematic by the regime, with his excesses nonetheless tolerated because of his international fame, as was the case with all famous GDR authors from Bertolt Brecht to Heine Müller and Christa Wolf? One cannot but recall here a witty formula regarding life under a harsh communist regime. Of three features, personal honesty, sincere support for the regime, intelligence, it was possible to combine only two, never all three. If one was honest and supportive, one was not very bright. If one was bright and supportive, one was not honest. If one was honest and bright, one was not supportive. The problem with Drayman is that he does actually combine all three features. Second, during a reception at the start of the film, a dissident directly and aggressively confronts the minister, without consequences. If such a thing was possible, was the regime really so terrible? Last, it is Christa Maria who breaks down and betrays the husband, which later leads to her suicidal flight from the apartment, crushed under the wheels of a truck. Whereas, in the overwhelming majority of real cases of married couples, when a spouse betrayed his partner and spied on her, it was the men who became IM, informelle Mitarbeiter, informal collaborators of the Stasi. The most extraordinary Cold War love story was the one between Vera Lengsfeld and Knud Wollenberger, who, in the now-defunct German Democratic Republic, got married and had 2 children together. After the fall of the wall, when Vera, a GDR dissident, gained access to her Stasi file, she learned that Knud, a Stasi informer codenamed Donald, had married and lived with her on the orders of his masters, so that he was able to report on her activities. Upon learning this, she immediately divorced him, and they have not spoken since. Afterwards, Knud sent her a letter explaining that he wanted to shield her, and that his betrayal was, in fact, an act of love. Now that he is dying of a galloping form of Parkinson's, Vera has announced that she has forgiven him. No wonder Hollywood is considering making a film with Meryl Streep as Vera. Betrayal as an act of love. The formula has already been proposed by John le Carré in his masterpiece, A Perfect Spy. The only way to account for the shift in the lives of others is to evoke a weird undercurrent of the story. In a blatant contradiction to the known facts, is the reason for this odd distortion of reality not the secret homosexual undercurrent in the film? It is clear that, in the course of his spying on the couple, Gerd Weissler becomes libidinally attracted to Drayman, effectively obsessed by him. It is this affection that gradually pushes him to help Drayman. After Die Wende, Drayman discovers what had gone on by gaining access to his files, following which he reciprocates in amorous terms, including tailing Weissler, who now works as a postman. The situation is thus effectively reversed. The observed victim is now the observer. In the film's last scene, Weissler goes to a bookstore, the legendary Karl Marx Buchhandlung on the Stalin Allee, of course, buys the writer's new novel, Sonata for an Honest Man, and discovers that it is dedicated to him, designated by his Stasi codename. Thus, to indulge in a somewhat cruel irony, the finale of The Lives of Others recalls the famous ending of Casablanca, the proverbial beginning of a beautiful friendship between Drayman and Weissler, with the intrusive female obstacle conveniently disposed of, a true Christological gesture of sacrifice. No wonder her name is Christa Maria. In contrast to this idyll, the very appearance of light-hearted nostalgic comedy in Goodbye Lenin is a facade which covers a much harsher underlying reality, signaled at the very beginning by the brutal intrusion of the Stasi into the family home after the husband escapes to the West. The lesson is thus much more desperate than that of The Lives of Others. No heroic resistance to the GDR regime was ultimately sustainable. The only way to survive was to escape into madness, to disconnect from reality. This, of course, in no way implies that Goodbye Lenin is without faults of its own. A comparison with another recent political thriller can be of some help here. John Malkovich's Dancer Upstairs. In both films, violence is framed by love. The love of a son for his mother, Goodbye Lenin, the love of a man for a woman, Dancer. In both cases, the function of love is stricto sensu ideological. It mystifies and thereby domesticates, renders tolerable the confrontation with the real of brutal traumatic violence, the violence of the GDR regime, as well as its collapse and the Western takeover, the violence of Sendero Luminoso's ruthless revolutionary terror. While both Lenin and Dancer confront a recent radical political past, significantly, one was a big hit and the other a box office failure. Goodbye Lenin tells the story of a son whose mother, an honest GDR believer, has a heart attack on the 40-year anniversary celebrations in 1991. She survives, but the doctor warns the son that any traumatic experience could cause the mother's death. With the help of a friend, the son thus stages for the mother, who is restricted to her apartment, the smooth continuation of the GDR. Every evening, they play on the TV video-recorded fake GDR news, and so on. Towards the film's end, the hero says that the game has gone too far. The fiction stage for the dying mother has become an alternative GDR, reinvented as it should have been. Therein resides the key political question, beyond the rather boring topic of nostalgia, which is not a real longing for the GDR, but the enactment of a real parting from it, the acquiring of a distance, de-traumatization. Was this dream of an alternative GDR inherent in the GDR itself? When, in the final fictional TV report, the new GDR leader, the first GDR astronaut, decides to open the borders, allowing the West German citizens to escape consumer terrorism, racism, and the hopeless struggle to survive, it is clear that the need for such a utopian escape is real. To put it quite brutally, while nostalgia is widely practiced in today's Germany without causing ethical problems, one, for the time being at least, cannot imagine publicly practicing a Nazi nostalgia, goodbye Hitler instead of goodbye Lenin. Does this not bear witness to the fact that we are still aware of the emancipatory potential, distorted and thwarted as it was, in communism, but which was completely missing in fascism? The quasi-metaphysical epiphany towards the film's end, when the mother, on her first walk outside the apartment, finds herself face-to-face with a statue of Lenin being transported by helicopter, whose outstretched hand seems to interpolate her directly, is thus to be taken more seriously than it may appear. The weak point of the film is that, like Roberto Benigni's Life is Beautiful, it sustains an ethics of protecting one's illusions. It manipulates the threat of a second heart attack as the means to blackmail us into accepting the need to protect one's fantasy as the highest ethical duty. Does the film here not endorse unexpectedly Leo Strauss's thesis on the need for a noble lie? But is it really that the emancipatory potential of communism is only a noble lie, to be staged and sustained for naive believers, a lie which actually only masks the ruthless violence of communist rule? The mother is the subject supposed to believe here. Through her, others sustain their belief. The irony is that it is usually the mother who is supposed to be the caregiver, protecting her children from cruel reality. Is the mother in Goodbye Lenin not the one who makes the law on behalf of the absent father here? So, since for Lacan, therein resides the genesis of male homosexuality, the true question is, why is the hero not gay, as he should have been? In contrast to Goodbye Lenin, Dancer Upstairs sees no redemptive potential in the figure of evil with which it is strangely fascinated. It should rather be read as yet another version of Conrad's voyage into the heart of darkness, epitomized here by the excessive cruelty and ruthlessness of the Sendero Luminoso movement which, so we are told, showed no interest in conquering public opinion with ideological programs, but simply waged its murderous campaign. Rejas, the honest liberal police investigator and the film's hero, is split between the corruption of those in power and the absolute evil of the revolution. This split is the one between form and content. Rejas supports the form of the existing democratic order. Although critical of its present content, the corrupt rapist president and so on, he rejects the revolutionary transgression of the form, the leap of faith into the inhuman dimension. However, the enigma that the film addresses is double. It is not primarily the enigma of the radical evil of Sendero Luminoso terror, but the enigma of Rejas' love object. How is it possible for a cultivated and beautiful middle-class ballet dancer to be a fanatical member of Sendero Luminoso? Why does Yolanda totally reject Rejas in the end? How to account for the gap that separates this sensitive and beautiful woman from the fanatical and merciless revolutionary that explodes at the end? Therein resides what one is tempted to call the constitutive stupidity of the film, and of the novel on which it is based. Publicized as an attempt to understand the Sendero Luminoso phenomenon, it is precisely a defense against such an understanding, an attempt to perpetuate the enigma it confronts. No wonder that, ultimately, Dancer Upstairs, which prides itself on being anti-Hollywood, relies on the basic Hollywood formula of the production of the couple. The real Hollywood left. If even the marginal non-Hollywood productions remain determined by the family motif, where then are we to find true exceptions to its rule? In March 2005, the Vatican itself made a highly publicized statement, condemning in the strongest terms Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code as a book based on lies and which spread false teachings. For example, that Jesus had married Mary Magdalene and that they had descendants. The true identity of the Grail is Mary Magdalene's vagina. Especially regretting the book's popularity among the younger generation searching for spiritual guidance. The absurdity of this Vatican intervention, sustained by a barely concealed longing for the good old days when the infamous index of prohibited books was still operative, should not blind us to the fact that, while the form is wrong, one almost suspects a conspiracy between the Vatican and the publisher to give a new boost to the sales of the book, the content is basically right. The Da Vinci Code does in fact propose a New Age reinterpretation of Christianity in terms of the balance of the masculine and feminine principles. That is, the basic idea of the novel is the reinscription of Christianity into a pagan sexualized ontology. The feminine principle is sacred. Perfection resides in the harmonious coupling of the male and female principles. The paradox to be accepted here is that, in this case, every feminist should support the church. It is only through the monotheistic suspension of the feminine signifier, of the polarity of the masculine and feminine opposites, that the space emerges for what we broadly refer to as feminism proper, for the rise of feminine subjectivity. The femininity asserted in the affirmation of the cosmic feminine principle is, on the contrary, always a subordinated, passive receptive pole, opposed to the active masculine principle. This is why thrillers like The Da Vinci Code are one of the key indicators of contemporary ideological shifts. The hero is in search of an old manuscript which will reveal some shattering secret which threatens to undermine the very foundations of institutionalized Christianity. The criminal edge is provided by the desperate and ruthless attempts of the church, or some hardline faction within it, to suppress this document. This secret focuses on the repressed feminine dimension of the divine. Christ was married to Mary Magdalene. The Grail is actually the female body. Is this revelation really such a surprise? Is the idea that Jesus had sex with Mary Magdalene not rather a kind of obscene open secret of Christianity? A Christian secret de polichinelle. The true surprise would have been to go a step further and claim that Mary had really been a transvestite, so that Jesus' lover had been a beautiful ephebe. The interest of the novel, and, against the suspiciously hasty dismissal of the film, one should say that this holds even more for the film, resides in a feature which, surprisingly, echoes the X-Files, where the fact that so many things happen out there, where the truth is supposed to dwell, aliens invading Earth and so on, fills the void. That is, the much closer truth that nothing, no sexual relation, is going on between the two agents, Mulder and Scully. In the Da Vinci Code, the sexual life of Christ and Mary Magdalene is the excess which inverts, covers up, the fact that the sexual life of Sophie, the heroine, Christ's last descendant, is non-existent. She is like a contemporary Mary, virginal, pure, asexual. There is no hint of sex between her and Robert Langdon. Her trauma is that she witnessed the primordial phantasmatic scene of parental copulation, this excess of jouissance which totally neutralized her sexuality. It is as if, in a kind of temporal loop, she was present at the act of her own conception, so that for her all sex is incestuous and thus prohibited. Here enters Robert, who, far from being her lover, acts as her wild analyst, whose task is to construct a narrative frame, a myth, which will enable her to break out of this phantasmatic captivity, not by way of regaining normal heterosexuality, but by way of accepting her asexuality and normalizing it as part of the new mythic narrative. In this sense, the Da Vinci Code belongs in the series we are analyzing. It is not really a film about religion, about the repressed secret of Christianity, but a film about a frigid and traumatized young woman who is redeemed, freed from her trauma, provided with a mythical framework that enables her to fully accept her asexuality. The mythical character of the solution emerges clearly if we contrast Robert, as its proponent, to Sir Lee, the counterpoint to Opus Dei in the film and novel. He wants to disclose the secret of Mary and thus save humanity from the oppression of official Christianity. The film rejects this radical move and opts for a fictional compromise solution. What is important are not facts, the DNA that would prove the genealogical link between her and Mary and Christ, but what she, Sophie, believes. The movie opts for a symbolic fiction against genealogical facts. The myth of being Christ's descendant creates for Sophie a new symbolic identity. At the end, she emerges as the leader of a community. It is at this level of what goes on in terrestrial life that the Da Vinci Code remains Christian. In the person of Sophie, it enacts the passage from sexual love to desexualized agape as political love, love that serves as the bond of a collective. There is nothing pre-Freudian in the solution. It can only appear pre-Freudian if one accepts the crude normative heterosexual version of psychoanalysis, according to which, for a woman, everything but normal heterosexual desire is pathological. For a true Freudian, on the contrary, there is no sexual relationship, no standard of normality, but only an inevitable deadlock, and the asexual position of withdrawing from the commerce between the sexes is as good a symptom, a symptomal knot which holds the subject together, to deal with this deadlock as any other position. In spite of this interesting displacement of the standard Hollywood formula, it would be, of course, ridiculous to claim that the Da Vinci Code belongs to the Hollywood left. One has to look for the real Hollywood left elsewhere. But where? Zack Snyder's 300, the saga of the 300 Spartan soldiers who sacrificed themselves at Thermopylae to halt the invasion of Xerxes' Persian army, was attacked as the worst kind of patriotic militarism, with clear allusions to the recent tensions with Iran and events in Iraq. Are, however, things really so clear? The film should, rather, be thoroughly defended against these accusations. There are 2 points to be made. The first concerns the story itself. It is the story of a small and poor country, Greece, invaded by the army of a much larger state, Persia, at that point much more developed and with advanced military technology. Are the Persian elephants, giants, and large fire arrows not the ancient version of high-tech weaponry? When the last surviving group of Spartans and their king, Leonidas, are killed by the thousands of arrows, are they not in a way bombed to death by techno-soldiers, operating sophisticated weapons from a safe distance, like today's US soldiers who at the push of a button launch rockets from the warships miles away in the Persian Gulf? Furthermore, Xerxes' words, when he attempts to convince Leonidas to accept Persian domination, definitely do not sound like those of a fanatical Muslim fundamentalist. He tries to seduce Leonidas into subjection by promising him peace and sensual pleasures if he rejoins the Persian global empire. All he asks from him is the formal gesture of kneeling in acknowledgement of Persian supremacy. If the Spartans do this, they will be given supreme authority over all Greece. Is this not similar to what President Reagan demanded from the Nicaraguan Sandinista government? All they had to do was say, "Hey, uncle," to the US. And is Xerxes' court not depicted as a kind of multiculturalist, different styles paradise? Everyone participates in orgies there, different races, lesbians and gays, the handicapped, and so forth. Are then the Spartans, with their discipline and spirit of sacrifice, not much closer to something like the Taliban defending Afghanistan against the US occupation? Or an elite unit of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard ready to sacrifice itself in the case of an American invasion? Perspicuous historians have already noted this parallel. This is from the blurb of Tom Holland's Persian Fire. In the 5th century BC, a global superpower was determined to bring truth and order to what it regarded as two terrorist states. The superpower was Persia, incomparably rich in ambition, gold, and men. The terrorist states were Athens and Sparta, eccentric cities in a poor and mountainous backwater. Greece. Western racist investment in the Battle of Thermopylae is evident. It was widely read as the first and decisive victory of the free West against the despotic East. No wonder Hitler and Goering compared the German defeat at Stalingrad in 1943 to Leonidas' heroic death at Thermopylae. However, it is for this very reason that one should invert the perspective. Western cultural racists like to claim that, had the Persians succeeded in subduing Greece, there would today be minarets all over Europe. This stupid claim is doubly wrong. Not only would there be no Islam in the case of the defeat of the Greeks, since there would have been no ancient Greek thought and no Christianity, two historical presuppositions of Islam. Even more important is the fact that there are minarets in many European cities today, and the kind of multicultural tolerance which made this possible was precisely the result of the Greek victory over the Persians. The main Greek arm against Xerxes' overwhelming military supremacy was discipline and the spirit of sacrifice. And, to quote Alain Badiou, "We need a popular discipline. I would even say that those who have nothing have only their discipline. The poor, those with no financial or military means, those with no power, all they have is their discipline, their capacity to act together. This discipline is already a form of organization." In today's era of hedonist permissivity, which serves as the dominant ideology, the time has come for the left to reappropriate discipline and the spirit of sacrifice. There is nothing inherently fascist about these values. But even this fundamentalist identity of the Spartans is more ambiguous. A programmatic statement towards the end of the film defines the Greeks' agenda as against the reign of mystique and tyranny, towards the bright future. Further specified is the rule of freedom and reason, which sounds like an elementary Enlightenment program, with even a communist twist. Recall also that at the film's beginning, Leonidas outrightly rejects the message of the corrupt oracles, according to whom the gods forbid the military expedition to stop the Persians. As we learn later, the oracles, who were allegedly receiving the divine message in an ecstatic trance, had in fact been paid by the Persians, like the Tibetan oracle, who in 1959 delivered the message to the Dalai Lama to leave Tibet, and who was, as we now know, on the payroll of the CIA. But what about the apparent absurdity of the idea of dignity, freedom, and reason sustained by extreme military discipline, including of the practice of discarding weak children? This absurdity is simply the price of freedom. Freedom is not free, as they put it in the film. Freedom is not something given. It is regained through a hard struggle in which one should be ready to risk everything. Spartan ruthless military discipline is not simply the external opposite of Athenian liberal democracy. It is its inherent condition. It lays the foundation for it. The free subject of reason can only emerge through ruthless self-discipline. True freedom is not a freedom of choice made from a safe distance, like choosing between a strawberry cake and a chocolate cake. True freedom overlaps with necessity. One makes a truly free choice when one's choice puts at stake one's very existence. One does it simply because one simply cannot do otherwise. When one's country is under foreign occupation, and one is called by a resistance leader to join the fight against the occupiers, the reason given is not, "You are free to choose," but, "Can't you see that this is the only thing you can do if you want to regain your dignity?" No wonder that all the 18th century egalitarian radicals, from Rousseau to the Jacobins, imagined Republican France as the new Sparta. There is an emancipatory core in the Spartan spirit of military discipline, which survives even when we subtract all the historical paraphernalia of Spartan class rule, ruthless exploitation of and terror over their slaves, and so forth. No wonder, too, that Trotsky himself called the Soviet Union, in the difficult years of war communism, a proletarian Sparta. Even more important is perhaps the film's formal aspect. The entire film was shot in a warehouse in Montreal, with the entire background and many of the people and objects digitally constructed. The artificial character of the background seems to infect the real actors themselves, who often appear like characters from comics brought to life. The film is based on Frank Miller's graphic novel 300. Furthermore, the artificial, digital nature of the background creates a claustrophobic atmosphere, as if the story is not taking place in real reality with its endless open horizons, but in a closed world, a kind of relief world of closed space. Aesthetically, we are here steps ahead of the Star Wars and Lord of the Rings series. Although in these series also, many background objects and persons are digitally created, the impression is nonetheless one of real and digital actors and objects, elephants, Yoda, uruks, palaces, etc., placed in a real open world. In 300, on the contrary, all the main characters are real actors placed against an artificial background. A combination which produces a much more uncanny, closed world of a cyborg mixture of real people integrated into an artificial world. It is only with 300 that the combination of real actors and objects with a digital environment has come close to creating a truly new autonomous aesthetic space. The practice of mixing different arts, of including in one artistic form the reference to another, has a long tradition, especially with regard to cinema. Many of Hopper's portraits of a woman at an open window, looking out, are clearly mediated by the experience of cinema. They offer a shot without its countershot. What makes 300 notable is that in it, not for the first time of course, but in a way which is artistically much more interesting than, say, Warren Beatty's Dick Tracy, a technically more developed art form, digitalized cinema, refers to a less developed form, comics. The effect produced is that of true reality, losing its innocence, appearing as part of a closed artificial universe, which is a perfect figuration of our socio-ideological predicament. Those critics who claim that the synthesis of the two art forms in 300 is a failure are thus wrong, because they are right. Of course the synthesis fails. Of course the universe we see on the screen is traversed by a profound antagonism and inconsistency. But it is this very antagonism which is an indication of truth. History and family in Frankenstein. There is, however, a more fundamental question to be raised apropos the family myth as interpretive tool. It seems obvious that the first task of the critique of ideology is, of course, to treat the family narrative as an ideological myth, which should be handled like a dream's explicit text, which should be deciphered back into the true struggle obfuscated by the family narrative. What if, however, one follows here the homology with the Freudian logic of dreams to the end, bearing in mind that the true focus of a dream, its unconscious desire, is not the dream thought, but something that, paradoxically, inscribes itself into a dream text through the very mechanisms of the transposition of the dream thought into the dream text. In other words, the unconscious desire in a dream is not simply its core, which never appears directly, which is distorted by the translation into the manifest dream text, but the very principle of this distortion. Here is Freud's unsurpassed formulation of this paradox. The latent dream thoughts are the material which the dream work transforms into the manifest dream. The only essential thing about dreams is the dream work that has influenced the thought material. We have no right to ignore it in our theory, even though we may disregard it in certain practical situations. Analytic observation shows further that the dream work never restricts itself to translating these thoughts into the archaic or regressive mode of expression that is familiar to you. In addition, it regularly takes possession of something else, which is not part of the latent thoughts of the previous day, but which is the true motif force for the construction of the dream. This indispensable addition, unentbehrliche Zutat, is the equally unconscious wish for the fulfillment of which the content of the dream is given its new form. A dream may thus be any sort of thing insofar as you are only taking into account the thoughts it represents, a warning, an intention, a preparation, and so on. But it is always also the fulfillment of an unconscious wish, and if you are considering it as a product of the dream work, it is only that. A dream is therefore never simply an intention or a warning, but always an intention, etc., translated into the archaic mode of thought by the help of an unconscious wish and transformed to fulfill that wish. The one characteristic, the wish fulfillment, is the invariable one. The other may vary. It may, for its part, once more be a wish, in which case the dream will, with the help of an unconscious wish, represent as fulfilled a latent wish of the previous day. Every detail is worth analyzing in this marvelous passage, from its implicit opening motto, what is good enough for practice, namely the search for the meaning of dreams, is not good enough for theory, to its concluding redoubling of the wish. Its key insight is, of course, the triangulation of latent dream thoughts, manifest dream content, and the unconscious wish, which limits the scope of, or rather directly undermines, the hermeneutic model of the interpretation of dreams, the path from the manifest dream content to its hidden meaning, the latent dream thought, which runs backwards the path of the formation of a dream, the transposition of the latent dream thought into the manifest dream content by dream work. The paradox is that this dream work is not merely a process of masking the dream's true message. The dream's true core, its unconscious wish, inscribes itself only through and in this very process of masking, so that the moment we retranslate the dream content back into the dream thought expressed in it, we lose the true motif force of the dream. In short, it is the process of masking itself which inscribes into the dream its true secret. One should therefore turn around the standard notion of the ever deeper penetration to the core of the dream. It is not that we first penetrate from the manifest dream content to the first level secret, the latent dream thought, and then, in a further step, even deeper, to the dream's unconscious core, the unconscious wish. The deeper wish is located in the very gap between the latent dream thought and manifest dream content. A perfect example of this logic in literature is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. A standard Marxist critical point about the novel is that it is focused on the dense family and sexuality network in order to obliterate, or rather repress, its true historical reference. History is internalized as a family drama. Larger socio-historical trends, from the monstrosity of revolutionary terror to the impact of scientific and technological revolutions, are reflected, staged, in a distorted manner, as Victor Frankenstein's troubles with his father, fiancé, and monstrous progeny. While all this is true, a simple mental experiment demonstrates the limitations of this approach. Imagine the same story, of Dr. Frankenstein and his monster, told as a story of the scientist and his experiment, without the accompanying family melodrama. the monster as the ambiguous obstacle to the sexual consummation of marriage. I'll be there on your wedding night, and so on. What we would end up with is an impoverished story, deprived of the dimension which accounts for its extraordinary libidinal impact. So, to put it in Freudian terms, it is true that the explicit narrative is like a dream text which refers in an encoded way to its true referent, its dream thought, the larger socio-historical dimension, reflecting it in a distorted way. However, it is through this very distortion and displacement that the text's unconscious wish, the sexualized fantasy, inscribes itself. The romantic notion of monstrosity is to be understood against the background of the distinction, elaborated by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, between imagination and fancy. Imagination is a creative power which generates organic and harmonious bodies, while fancy stands for a mechanical assemblage of parts which do not fit each other, so that the product is a monstrous combination, lacking any harmonious unity. In Frankenstein, the story of a monster, this topic of monstrosity is not limited to the narrative content. It somehow spills over and pervades other levels. There are 3 levels of monstrosity fancy. 1. First, most obviously, the monster reanimated by Victor is mechanically composed of parts, not a harmonious organism. 2. Then, as the novel's social background, social unrest and revolution as a monstrous decomposition of society. With the advent of modernity, traditional harmonious society is replaced by an industrialized society in which people interact mechanically as individuals, following their egotistic interests, no longer feeling that they belong to a wider whole, and occasionally exploding in violent rebellions. Modern societies oscillate between oppression and anarchy. The only unity that can take place in them is the artificial unity imposed by brutal power. 3. Finally, there is the novel itself, a monstrous, clumsy, inconsistent composite of different parts, narrative modes, and genres. To these 3, one should add a 4th level of monstrosity, that of the interpretations provoked by the novel. What does the monster mean? What does it stand for? It can mean the monstrosity of social revolution, of sons rebelling against fathers, of modern industrial production, of asexual reproduction, of scientific knowledge. We thus get a multitude of meanings which do not form a harmonious whole, but just coexist side by side. The interpretation of monstrosity thus ends up in monstrosity, fancy, of interpretations. How are we to find our way in this monstrosity? It is easy to show that the true focus of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is the monstrosity of the French Revolution, its degeneration into terror and dictatorship. Mary and Percy Shelley were ardent students of the literature and polemics regarding the French Revolution. Victor creates his monster in the same city, Ingolstadt, that a conservative historian of the Revolution, Baruel, Mary read his book repeatedly, cites as the source of the French Revolution. It was in Ingolstadt that the secret society of Illuminati planned the revolution. The monstrosity of the French Revolution was described by Eben Burke precisely in the terms of a state killed and revived as a monster. Out of the tomb of the murdered monarchy in France has arisen a vast, tremendous, unformed spectre in a far more terrific guise than any which ever yet have overpowered the imagination and subdued the fortitude of man. Going straight forward to its end, unappalled by peril, unchecked by remorse, despising all common maxims and all common means, that hideous phantom overpowered those who could not believe it was possible she could exist at all. Furthermore, Frankenstein is dedicated to Mary's father, William Godwin, known for his utopian ideas about the regeneration of the human race. Godwin entertained millennial expectations in An Inquiry Concerning the Principles of Political Justice, 1793, where he exulted in nothing less than the coming of a new human race. This race, to emerge once overpopulation had been scientifically brought under control, was to be produced by social engineering, not sexual intercourse. In the novel, Victor says, "A new species would bless me as its creator and source. Many happy and excellent natures would owe their being to me. No father could claim the gratitude of his child so completely as I should deserve theirs. The symbolic association between Godwin and monsters was forged in 1796 to 1802, when the conservative reaction against him reached its peak. During those years, demons and the grotesque were frequently used to deflate Godwin's theories about the utopian regeneration of humanity. Conservatives depicted Godwin and his writings as a nascent monster that had to be stamped out, lest England were to go the way of revolutionary France. Horace Walpole called Godwin one of the greatest monsters exhibited by history. In 1800, the Anti-Jacobin Review, which championed the attack upon William Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft, denounced the couple's disciples as the spawn of the monster. Frankenstein does not directly approach its true focus. Instead, it tells the story as a depoliticized family drama or family myth. The characters of the novel reenact earlier political polemics on the level of personal psychology. In the 1790s, writers such as Edmund Burke had warned of a collective parricidal monster, the revolutionary regime in France, in the aftermath of the revolution. Mary Shelley scales this symbolism down to the domestic size. Her novel reenacts the monster trope, but it does so from the perspective of isolated and subjective narrators who are locked in parricidal struggles of their own. In this way, the novel can maintain its true topic at a distance, invisible. As we have noted, this is also the standard Marxist critical point about Frankenstein. It is focused on the dense family and sexuality network in order to obliterate, or rather repress, its true historical reference. But why must Frankenstein obfuscate its true historical referent? Because its relationship to this true focus topic, the French Revolution, is deeply ambiguous and contradictory, and the form of the family myth makes it possible to neutralize this contradiction, to evoke all these incompatible attitudes as parts of the same story. Not only is Frankenstein a myth in Levi Strauss's sense, an imaginary resolution of real contradictions. One should also follow Levi Strauss when he claims that Freud's analysis of the Oedipus myth is another version of the Oedipus myth, to be treated in the same way as the original myth. Further variations of a myth try to displace and resolve in another way the contradiction which the original myth tried to resolve. In the case of Frankenstein, one should therefore treat as part of the same myth as its further variation the cinematic versions, of which there are more than 50, and the manner they transform the original story. Here are the main moments. 1. Frankenstein, the best known, James Whale's classic from 1931, with Boris Karloff as the monster. Its main feature is that it leaves out the subjectivization of the monster. The monster is never allowed to tell the story in the first person. It remains a monstrous other. 2. In Frankenstein, the True Story, 1973, Frankenstein creates a handsome young man whom he educates for society, but the creature's body begins to degenerate, turning him against his maker. 3. In The Bride, 1985, after Frankenstein abandons his original creature as a failure, he creates a beautiful female and educates her to be his perfect mate, but she also escapes his control. 4. In Kenneth Branagh's Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, after the monster kills Victor's bride, Victor, in a desperate move, reassembles and reanimates her. The scene culminates in Victor dancing with his reanimated wife. 5. Finally, although it does not directly refer to Frankenstein, in Ridley Scott's Blade Runner 1982, Police Lieutenant Deckard is assigned to hunt down and eliminate a group of replicants, superhuman creatures genetically engineered for slave labor, who have rebelled against their creators and are hiding in Los Angeles. The showdown between Deckard and Batty, the replicant leader, obviously refers to the conflict between Frankenstein and the monster. Here, Batty, in the final act of reconciliation, saves Deckard from certain death. What all these films have in common is that they all reproduce the basic prohibition of the original novel. None of them directly approaches the political topic, the monstrosity of social rebellion. They all tell the story through the frame of family, love, relations. So in what does the novel's contradictory attitude to its central topic consist? The motif of the monstrosity of the revolution is a conservative element, and the novel's form, a confession of the principal character at the point of death, is clearly related to a conservative genre popular in Shelley's time, in which, after they are forced to confront the catastrophic results of their dreams about universal freedom and brotherhood, repentant ex-radicals renounce their reforming ways. However, Shelley does here something that a conservative would never have done. In the central part of the book, she moves a step further and directly gives a voice to the monster himself, who is allowed to tell the story from his own perspective. This step expresses the liberal attitude of freedom of speech at its most radical. Everyone's point of view should be heard. In Frankenstein, the monster is not a thing, a horrible object no one dares to confront. He is fully subjectivized. Mary Shelley moves inside the mind of the monster and asks what it is like to be labeled, defined, oppressed, excommunicated, even physically distorted by society. The ultimate criminal is thus allowed to present himself as the ultimate victim. The monstrous murderer reveals himself to be a deeply hurt and desperate individual, yearning for company and love. So it is crucial to see in what consists the monster's own story. The monster tells us that his identity as a rebel and murderer was learned, not innate. In direct contradiction to the Burkean tradition of the monster as evil incarnate, the creature tells Frankenstein, "I was benevolent and good. Misery made me a fiend." Surprisingly, the monster proves to be a very philosophical rebel. He explains his actions in traditional Republican terms. He claims to have been driven to rebellion by the failings of the ruling order. His superiors and protectors have shirked their responsibilities towards him, impelling him to insurrection. Monsters rebel not because they are infected by the evils of the godless radical philosophy, but because they have been oppressed and misused by the regnant order. Mary Shelley's source was here her own mother's study, an historical and moral view of the origin and progress of the French Revolution, 1794, in which Mary Wollstonecraft, after agreeing with the Burkean conservatives that rebels are monsters, resolutely insists that these monsters are social products. They are not the living dead, nor are they spectres arisen from the tomb of the murdered monarchy. Rather, they are the products of oppression, misrule, and despotism under the Ancien Régime. The lower orders are driven to rebellion. They turn against their oppressors in parricidal fashion. It is here that the novel comes closest to politics. The monster develops a radical critique of oppression and inequality. I heard of the division of property, of immense wealth and squalid poverty, of rank, descent, and noble blood. He speaks in the manner of Revolutionary-era radicals. I learned that the possessions most esteemed by your fellow creatures were high and unsullied descent, united with riches. A man might be respected with only one of these acquisitions, but without either he was considered, except in very rare occasions, as a vagabond and a slave, doomed to waste his powers for the profit of the chosen few. Here Mary Shelley effectively develops the dialectic of enlightenment, 150 years before Adorno and Horkheimer. She goes much further than the usual conservative warnings about how scientific and political progress turns into nightmare, chaos, and violence, how man should retain proper humility in the face of the mystery of creation and not try to become a master of life, which should remain a divine prerogative. The monster is a pure subject of the Enlightenment. After his reanimation, he is a natural man. His mind a tabula rasa. Left alone, abandoned by his creator, he has to reenact the Enlightenment theory of development. He has to learn everything from zero level by reading and by experience. His first months are effectively the realization of a kind of philosophical experiment. The fact that he morally fails, that he turns into a murderous, vengeful monster, is not a condemnation of him, but of the society which he approaches with the best intentions, and a need to love and be loved. His sad fate illustrates perfectly Rousseau's thesis that man is by nature good, and that it is society that corrupts him. The very fear of progress is not necessarily a conservative motif. Recall that in Mary Shelley's England, Luddites, gangs of desperate workers, were destroying industrial machines in protest against the loss of jobs and the greater exploitation that machines meant for them. Furthermore, Feminists read Frankenstein not as a conservative warning about the dangers of progress, but as a proto-feminist critique of the dangers of masculine knowledge and technology, which aim to dominate the world and gain control over human life itself. This fear is still with us today, the fear that scientists will create a new form of life or artificial intelligence which will run out of our control and turn against us. There is, finally, a fundamental ambiguity that pertains to the very motif of the son's rebellion as a monstrosity. Whose rebellion is this in the novel? Rebellion is redoubled. The first rebel against paternal order is Victor himself, and the monster rebels against the rebellious son. Victor rebels against the proper paternal order. His creation of the monster is asexual reproduction, not the normal succession of generations in a family. This brings us to the Freudian notion of the unheimlich, the uncanny. What is the most unheimlich thing, that closest to us and at the same time the object of horror and disgust? Incest. The incestuous subject literally stays at home. He does not need to look for his sexual partner outside, and he engages in a secret activity which inspires fear and shame in all of us. No wonder, then, that hints of incest occur twice in Frankenstein. Walton writes his letters, and at the novel's end decides to return, not to his wife, but to his sister. In the first edition of the novel, Victor's bride is his half-sister. So when the monster is really there at the wedding night and kills the bride, he prevents at the last moment the consummation of an incestuous union. Walton's and Victor's urge to leave home and engage in a risky transgressive act is thus more ambiguous than it may seem. They both do it not out of some pathological blasphemous ambition, but in order to escape the incestuous stuffiness of their home. There must be something wrong at home. Mary's husband Percy described what was wrong in his famous sonnet, England in 1819. An old, mad, blind, despised, and dying king, princes, the dregs of their dull race, who flow through public scorn, mud from a muddy spring. Rulers who neither see nor feel nor know, but leech-like to their fainting country cling, till they drop, blind in blood, without a blow. A people starved and stabbed in the untilled field. An army which, liberticide and prey, makes as a two-edged sword to all who wield, golden and sanguine laws which tempt and slay, religion Christless, godless, a book sealed, a senate, time's worst statute unrepealed, our graves, from which a glorious phantom may burst to illumine our tempestuous day. A conservative would reply, of course, that this phantom, which may burst from a grave to illumine our tempestuous day, may turn out not to be so glorious after all, but rather a phantom of murderous revenge like Frankenstein's monster. This brings us to Mary Shelley's contradiction, the contradiction between oppression and anarchy, between the stifling and oppressive home and the murderous consequences of our attempts to break out of it. Unable to resolve this contradiction and not willing to confront it directly, she could only tell it as a family myth. The lesson of all these impasses is not that one should bypass the family myth and turn directly to social reality. What one should do is something much more difficult, to undermine the family myth from within. The key testimony of a struggle to achieve this goal is Kafka's letter to his father. A letter which did arrive at its destination. The 2001 Darwin Award for the Most Stupid Act was posthumously conferred on an unfortunate woman from rural Romania who woke up during her funeral procession. Crawling out of her coffin and realizing what was going on, she ran away in blind terror, only to be hit by a truck on a busy road and instantly killed. So she was put back into the coffin and the funeral procession carried on. Is this not the ultimate example of what we call fate, of a letter arriving at its destination? A letter can also reach its destination precisely insofar as its addressee refuses to receive it, as is the case towards the end of Troilus and Cressida, Shakespeare's aforementioned neglected masterpiece, when the deceived lover Troilus rips up and throws away the letter from his Cressida, in which he tries to explain her flirtation with Diomedes. We never learn what was in the letter, although the scene cannot but arouse our melodramatic expectations. Will Cressida redeem herself? Explain it all? The force of this expectation accounts for the fact that, throughout the 18th century, the version of the play usually performed was Dryden's revision from 1679, in which Cressida is fully redeemed. We learn that she has plotted with her father an escape back to Troy and to Troilus, and that her seeming surrender to Diomedes was merely a ploy to enable that. So, what if Shakespeare wanted to make a point, and not just to keep our curiosity in suspension, when he refuses to divulge its content? What if the letter was meant to be rejected? The scene to which this letter refers occurred earlier, when, after Cressida and Troilus spent their first, and only, night together, she was delivered by her own father to the Greeks as part of a cold bargain, in exchange for a Trojan warrior, captured by the Greeks. In the Greek camp, she was given as booty to Diomedes. In his tent, she flirts with him, shamelessly offering herself under the gaze of Troilus, who was being brought to the tent by Ulysses. After Diomedes leaves the tent, she reflects aloud, "Troilus, farewell. One eye yet looks on thee, but with my heart the other eye doth see. Ah, poor our sex! This fault in us I find, the error of our eye directs our mind. What error leads must err. Oh, then conclude, minds swayed by eyes are full of turpitude." The key question to be raised here is, what if Cressida had been all the time aware of being observed by Troilus, and just pretended to be thinking aloud, alone? What if the entire seduction scene, her shameless attempt to arouse Diomedes' desire, was staged for Troilus' gaze? Let us not forget that Cressida announces her split nature already at the lovers' first anxious meeting, when she ominously warns Troilus of how, "I have a kind of self that resides with you, but an unkind self that itself will leave to be another's fool," thereby foreshadowing his bitter statement, after witnessing her flirting with Diomedes, that, in her, there is no rule in unity itself. This strange internal dislocation of hers is more complex than it may appear. Part of her loves him, but this part is unkind. And, with the same necessity that linked her to Troilus, will soon push her towards another man. The general lesson of this is that, in order to interpret a scene or an utterance, sometimes the key thing to do is to locate its true addressee. In one of the best Perry Mason novels, the lawyer witnesses a police interrogation of a couple, in the course of which the husband tells the policeman in unexpectedly great detail what happened, what he saw, and what he thinks happened. Why this excessive information? The solution? This couple committed the murder, and since the husband knew that he and his wife would soon be arrested on suspicion of the murder and kept separated, he used this opportunity to tell his wife the false story they should both cling to. The true addressee of his endless talk was thus not the policeman, but his wife. And thus we come to Franz Kafka's letter to his father, in which he articulated the crisis of paternal authority in all its ambiguity. No wonder that the first impression one gets in reading Kafka's letter is that there is something missing in it, the final twist along the lines of the parable on the door of the law. This door was here only for you. The father's display of terror and rage is here only for you. You have invested in it. You are sustaining it. One can well imagine the real Hermann Kafka as a benevolent and nice gentleman, genuinely surprised at the role he played in his son's imagination. To put it in Californian style, Kafka had a serious attitude problem with regard to his father. When Kafka identified himself as Louis, assuming his mother's name, he located himself in a series which comprises Adorno, who also shifted from father's name, Wiesengrund, to his mother's family name, not to mention Hitler, from Schickel-Gruber, all uneasy with assuming the role of the bearer of the paternal name. This is why one of the points in the letter to his father is Kafka's claim that it would have been possible for him to accept the person of his father, to establish a non-traumatic relationship with him if he were his friend, brother, boss, even father-in-law, just not his father. What bothers Kafka is the excessive presence of his father. He is too much alive, too obscenely intrusive. However, this father's excessive presence is not a direct fact. It appears as such only against the background of the suspension of the father's symbolic function. This father's too-muchness, as Eric Santner would call it, is ultimately the too-muchness of life itself, the humiliating quality of the father's excess of vitality which undermines his authority. Let us note how Kafka notices his father's taste for indecent expressions which you would produce in the loudest possible voice, laughing about them as though you had said something particularly good, while in point of fact it was only a banal little obscenity. At the same time, this again was for me a humiliating manifestation of your vitality. Again, one should bear in mind the proper order of causality. It is not that his father's excessive vitality undermines his symbolic authority. It is, rather, the other way around. Namely, the very fact that Kafka is bothered by his father's excessive vitality already presupposes the failure of symbolic authority. What is the true function of the name of the father? It is, precisely, to allow the subject to symbolically kill the father, to be able to abandon his father and the close family circle, and freely set out on his own path in the world. No wonder, then, that Kafka's reluctance to assume the name of the father is the very indication of his failure to break away from his father. What the letter to Kafka's father bears witness to is a subject who is doomed to remain forever in the paternal shadow, caught up with him in a libidinal deadlock. Far from enabling him to elude his father's grasp, Kafka's refusal to accept the father's name is the surest sign of this imprisonment. Not in any sense a passive victim of his father's terror, Kafka was directing the game. Recall from the long debate between the man from the countryside and the priest, which follows the parable about the door of the law in Kafka's The Trial. The priests claim that the man from the countryside was in the superior position and that the guardian of the door was really subordinated to him. The proof? If there ever was a screen memory, it is the accident from when he was 2 months old that Kafka claims as the only thing from his childhood of which he has a direct memory, and appeals to his father that he should also remember it. It was reconstructed afterwards, probably from what the parents told Franz about it. But covering what, we may ask? Like the primal scene of the Wolfman, it is a retroactive fantasy. There is only one episode in the early years of which I have a direct memory. You may remember it too. One night I kept on whimpering for water, not, I am certain, because I was thirsty, but probably partly to be annoying, partly to amuse myself. After several vigorous threats had failed to have any effect, you took me out of bed, carried me out onto the pavlach, the Czech word for the long balcony in the inner courtyard of old houses in Prague, and left me there alone for a while in my nightshirt, outside the shut door. I am not going to say that this was wrong. Perhaps there really was no other way of getting peace and quiet that night, but I mention it as typical of your methods of bringing up a child and their effect on me. I dare say I was quite obedient afterward at that period, but it did me inner harm. What was for me a matter of course, that senseless asking for water, and then the extraordinary terror of being carried outside, were two things that I, my nature being what it was, could never properly connect with each other. Even years afterwards, I suffered from the tormenting fancy that the huge man, my father, the ultimate authority, would come almost for no reason at all and take me out of bed in the night and carry me out onto the pavlach, and that consequently I meant absolutely nothing as far as he was concerned. The gurgling, signifying chain of the child intended to provoke the father is like the obscene soft sounds on the phone line from the castle, or the US Marines marching chants. There is thus a hidden link between the subversive pre-symbolic babble of the child and the inaccessible power that terrorizes the Kafkian hero, between superego and id. The true underlying reproach to the father is not his power and arrogant display of authority, but, on the contrary, his impotence, his lack of symbolic authority. Are the father's terrifying outbursts of rage, Wuten, not so many signs of his basic impotence, signals that his cold and efficient authority has failed? The father himself accounted for his imperious temperament as due to his nervous heart condition, not exactly a sign of power, but, as is clear to Kafka himself, a method of cheap manipulation worthy of a weakling. The nervous heart condition is a means by which you exert your domination more strongly, since the thought of it necessarily chokes off the least opposition from others. Here is another of the father's ritualistic displays of power. It was also terrible when you ran around the table, shouting, grabbing at one, obviously not really trying to grab, yet pretending to. A ridiculous, self-undermining display of power. Furthermore, what kind of a father feels so threatened by his 2-month-old son that he has to undertake the absurdly excessive measure of taking him out of the apartment? A truly authoritative figure would deal with the problem with a cold stare. And, incidentally, in the standard patriarchal family, which the Kafka family certainly was, is the first sign of the lack of authority not already the fact that it was the father, not the mother, who came to respond to the child? It is no less clear that the description of the father's intellectual domination is sustained by a barely concealed fear that this obvious fraud, this semblance of authority, will burst like a balloon, laying bare father's stupidity. From your armchair you ruled the world. Your opinion was correct, every other was mad, wild, meshuggah, not normal. Your self-confidence indeed was so great that you had no need to be consistent at all, and yet never ceased to be in the right. It did sometimes happen that you had no opinions whatsoever about a matter, and as a result, every conceivable opinion with respect to the matter was necessarily wrong without exception. You were capable, for instance, of running down the Czechs, and then the Germans, and then the Jews, and what is more, not only selectively, but in every respect. And finally, nobody was left except yourself. For me, you took on the enigmatic quality that all tyrants have, whose rights are based on their person, and not on reason. No wonder Kafka's exclusive sense of guilt has been replaced by insight into our helplessness, yours and mine. We have thus to be very precise when we are dealing with the topic of paternal authority. Authority is not to be confused with an overbearing, violently intrusive presence. That is to say, one way to read Kafka's bewilderment with regard to his father is to decipher it as the experience of the gap, the contrast between the ridiculous, pretentious, and impotent figure that is the reality of his father, and the immense power he nonetheless exerts. How can such a pathetic figure nonetheless exert such power? The answer would then be the socio-symbolic network that invests an empirical person with power, and the gap would be that of a symbolic castration. From the traditional rituals of investiture, we know the objects which not only symbolize power, but put the subject who acquires them into the position of effectively exercising power. If a king holds in his hands the scepter and wears the crown, his words will be taken as the words of a king. Such insignia are external, not part of my nature. I don them. I wear them in order to exert power. As such, they castrate me. They introduce a gap between what I immediately am and the function that I exercise. That is, I am never fully at the level of my function. This, however, is not the way Kafka experiences his father. The problem for Kafka is rather that his father's bodily presence disturbs the efficacy of the paternal symbolic function. In other words, his father's excessive, almost spectral, towering presence, whose impact exceeds the immediate reality of his person, is not the excess of the symbolic authority over immediate reality. It is the excess of the phantasmatic obscenity of the real. In Freudian terms, the problem with Kafka's father is that, in Franz's eyes, he has regressed from the agency of symbolic law to the primordial father, Urvater. There are two modes of the master, the public symbolic master and the secret evil magician who effectively pulls the strings and does his work during the night. When the subject is endowed with symbolic authority, he acts as an appendix to his symbolic title. That is, it is the big other, the symbolic institution, which acts through him. Suffice it to recall a judge, who may be a miserable and corrupted person, but the moment he puts on his robe and other insignia, his words are the words of the law itself. On the other hand, the invisible master, whose exemplary case is the anti-Semitic figure of the Jew, who, invisible to the public eye, pulls the strings of social life, is a kind of uncanny double of public authority. He has to act in the shadows, irradiating a phantom-like spectral omnipotence. The disintegration of the patriarchal symbolic authority of the name of the Father gives rise to a new figure of the Master, who is simultaneously our common peer, our neighbor, our imaginary double, and for this very reason phantasmatically endowed with another dimension of the evil genius. In Lacanian terms, the suspension of the ego ideal, of the feature of symbolic identification, that is, the reduction of the Master to an imaginary ideal, necessarily gives rise to its monstrous obverse, to the superego figure of the omnipotent evil genius who controls our lives. In this figure, the imaginary, semblance, and the real, of paranoia, overlap, due to the suspension of proper symbolic efficiency. The Kafkian law is not prohibitive, not even intrusive or imposing. Its repeated message to the subject is, "You are free to do whatever you want, don't ask me for orders," which of course is the perfect superego formula. No wonder that the message of Kafka's father to his son was, "Do whatever you like. So far as I'm concerned, you have a free hand. You're of age, I've no advice to give you." The series of the father's rhetorical methods, as enumerated by Kafka, abuse, threats, irony, spiteful laughter, and, oddly enough, self-pity, are the most concise rendering of the superego's ambiguity. Kafka's father was definitely a luder, if ever there was one, a figure out of which an orgy of malice and spiteful delight emanated. The link here is between Kafka and David Lynch, namely the excessive clownish figures of terrorist authority in Blue Velvet, Wild at Heart, June, Lost Highway. The superego's basic trick consists in reproaching the subject for not living up to its high expectations, while simultaneously sabotaging the subject's efforts, or mockingly expressing disbelief in the subject's capacities, and then laughing at the subject's failure. Kafka clearly noticed this paradox apropos of his father's demands that he should become an autonomous person who succeeds on his own. But that wasn't what you wanted at all. The situation had, after all, become quite different as a result of all your efforts, and there was no opportunity to distinguish oneself as you had done. Such an opportunity would first of all have had to be created by violence and revolutions. It would have meant breaking away from home, assuming one had had the resolution and strength to do so, and that mother wouldn't have worked against it, for her part, with other means. But that was not what you wanted at all. That you termed ingratitude, extravagance, disobedience, treachery, madness. And so, while on the one hand you tempted me to it by means of example, story, and humiliation, on the other hand you forbade it with the utmost severity. This is the obscene superego in its contrast to the name of the Father. The very injunction, "be autonomous," in its mode of operation, sabotages its goal. The very injunction, "be free," ties the subject up forever in the vicious circle of dependence. One can retell in these superego terms even the remark allegedly made by Brecht apropos the accused at the Moscow show trials in the 1930s. If they are innocent, they deserve all the more to be shot. This statement is thoroughly ambiguous. It can be read as the standard assertion of radical Stalinism. Your very insistence on your individual innocence, your refusal to sacrifice yourself for the cause, bears witness to your guilt, which resides in privileging your individuality over the larger interests of the party. Or it can be read as its opposite, in a radically anti-Stalinist way. If they were in a position to plot and execute the execution of Stalin and his entourage, and were innocent, that is, they did not grasp the opportunity, they effectively deserve to die for failing to rid us of Stalin. The true guilt of the accused is thus that, instead of rejecting the very ideological framework of Stalinism and ruthlessly acting against Stalin, they narcissistically fell in love with their victimization, and either protested their innocence or became fascinated by the ultimate sacrifice they were making to the party by confessing their non-existent crimes. So the properly dialectical way of grasping the imbrication of these two meanings would have been to start with the first reading, followed by the common-sense moralistic reaction to Brecht. But how can you claim something so ruthless? Can such a logic, which demands blind self-sacrifice for the accusatory whims of the leader, not function only within a terrifying criminal totalitarian universe? Far from accepting these rules, it is the duty of every ethical subject to fight such a universe with all means possible, including the physical removal, killing, of the totalitarian leadership. So you see how, if the accused are innocent, they deserve all the more to be shot. They effectively were in a position to organize a plot to rid us of Stalin and his henchmen, and missed this unique opportunity to spare humanity from terrible crimes. This, again, is the twisted superego logic at its purest. The more you are innocent, the more you are guilty, because your innocence itself, innocence in the eyes of whom, with regard to what, with regard to the obscene criminal power, is the proof of your guilt, of your complicity with this power. Although Freud uses three distinct terms for the agency that pushes the subject act ethically, he speaks of the ideal ego, idealich, ego ideal, ich ideal, and superego, Uberich. As a rule, he conflated the three. He often uses the expression ich ideal oder idealich, ego ideal or ideal ego, and the title of chapter 3 of The Ego and the Id is The Ego and Superego, ego ideal. Lacan, however, introduces a precise distinction between these three terms. The ideal ego stands for the idealized self-image of the subject. The way I would like to be, I would like others to see me. The ego ideal is the agency whose gaze I try to impress with my ego image, the big other who watches over me and pushes me to give my best. The ideal I try to follow and actualize. And the superego is this same agency in its vengeful, sadistic, punishing aspect. The underlying structuring principle of these three terms is clearly Lacan's triad: imaginary, symbolic, real. The ideal ego is imaginary, what Lacan calls the small other, the idealized double image of my ego. The ego ideal is symbolic, the point of my symbolic identification, the point in the big other from which I observe and judge myself. The superego is real, the cruel and insatiable agency which bombards me with impossible demands and which mocks my failed attempts to meet them. The agency in the eyes of which I am all the more guilty, the more I try to suppress my sinful strivings and live up to its exigencies. What follows from these precise distinctions is that, for Lacan, the superego has nothing to do with moral conscience as far as its most obligatory demands are concerned. The superego is, on the contrary, the anti-ethical agency, the stigmatization or ethical betrayal. So which one of the other two is the proper ethical agency? Should we, as some American psychoanalysts propose, set up the good, rational, moderate, caring, ego ideal against the bad, irrational, excessive, cruel, anxiety-provoking superego, trying to lead the patient to get rid of the bad superego and follow the good ego ideal? Lacan opposes this easy way out. For him, the only proper agency is the fourth one, missing from Freud's tripartite list, the one sometimes referred to by Lacan as the law of desire, the agency which tells you to act in conformity with your desire. The gap between this law of desire and the ego ideal, the network of social symbolic norms and ideals that the subject internalizes in the course of her education, is crucial here. For Lacan, the ego ideal, this seemingly benevolent agency, which leads us to moral growth and maturity, forces us to betray the law of desire by adopting the reasonable demands of the existing socio-symbolic order. The superego, with its excessive feeling of guilt, is merely the necessary obverse of the ego ideal. It exerts its unbearable pressure upon us on behalf of our betrayal of the law of desire. In short, for Lacan, the guilt we experience under the superego's pressure is not illusory, but actual. The only thing of which one can be guilty is of having given ground relative to one's desire. And the superego's pressure demonstrates that we effectively are guilty of betraying our desire. Back to Kafka. He formulates this same insight apropos the father's reactions to his attempts to get married. The fundamental thought behind both attempts at marriage was quite sound: to set up house, to become independent. An idea that does appeal to you, only in reality it always turns out like the children's game in which one holds and even grips the other's hand, calling out, "Oh, go away, why don't you go away?" What the father was thus preventing is Kafka's marriage. In his case, the father did not act as the guarantor of marriage, as the agent of symbolic authority. See Lacan's thesis that a harmonious sexual relationship can only take place under the cover of the name of the father. But as its superego obstacle, as what Freud, in his analysis of E.T.A. Hoffmann's Sandman, calls Liebesstorer, the obstacle which disturbs, prevents the love relationship. We encounter here the superego paradox at its purest. The father who prevents the love relationship is precisely the obscene father who enjoins us to do it, to engage in sexual promiscuity without constraints. And inversely, the father who opens up the space for a love relationship is the father who is the agency of prohibition, of the symbolic law. That is to say, Kafka's desire for a proper father is not a masochistic desire for subordination to an authority. It is, on the contrary, a desire for freedom and autonomy. The paradox is thus that freedom from his father means assuming his father's name, which puts them on the same level. Marriage certainly is the pledge of the most acute form of self-liberation, independence. I would have a family, in my opinion the highest one can achieve, and so too the highest you have achieved. The choice Kafka confronted was between the two ways of escaping from his father. Two modes of independence, marriage or writing, le père ou pire, his father or the almost nothing of writing. In my writing, and in everything connected with it, I have made some attempts at independence, attempts at escape, with the very smallest of success. They will scarcely lead any farther. Much confirms this for me. Nevertheless, it is my duty, or rather the essence of my life, to watch over them, to let no danger that I can avert, indeed no possibility of such a danger, approach them. Marriage bears the possibility of such a danger. And he continues, the final outcome is certain. I must renounce. The simile of the bird in the hand and the two in the bush has only a fiery remote application here. In my hand I have nothing. In the bush is everything. And yet, so it is decided by the conditions of battle and the exigency of life, I must choose the nothing. Kafka's self-humiliation, which includes excremental identification. And so, if the world consisted only of me and you, a notion I was much inclined to have, then this purity of the world came to an end with you, and, by virtue of your advice, the filth began with me, is thus profoundly deceptive. It is easy to discern in Kafka's claim that he is the result of your upbringing and of my obedience, the stratagem of denying one's own libidinal involvement in one's sad fate. The strategy is clear here. I willingly assume my filth in order for my father to remain pure. This becomes especially clear when one bears in mind when, precisely, this self-identification with filth occurs, at the exact and most traumatic point of the letter, when Kafka reports on the rare moments when his father offered him realistic/obscene advice on how to deal with sex. Do it discreetly, have your fun, do not take things too seriously, do not fall for the first girl who offers herself to you. Remember, they are all the same horrors. Just use them and move on. For example, Kafka recalls a brief discussion that followed. The announcement of my latest marriage plans. You said to me something like, she probably put on a fancy blouse, something these Prague Jewesses are good at, and right away, of course, you decided to marry her. And that as fast as possible, in a week, tomorrow, today. I can't understand you. After all, you're a grown man, you live in the city, and you don't know what to do but marry the first girl who comes along. Isn't there anything else you can do? If you're frightened, I'll go with you. You put it in more detail and more plainly, but I can no longer recall the details. Perhaps, too, things became a little vague before my eyes. I paid almost more attention to Mother, who, though in complete agreement with you, took something from the table and left the room with it. You have hardly ever humiliated me more deeply with words and shown me your contempt more clearly. The real meaning of this advice was clear to Kafka. What you advised me to do was, in your opinion, and even more in my opinion at that time, the filthiest thing possible. For Kafka, this displacement of filth onto the son was part of the father's strategy to keep himself pure. And it is at this point that Kafka's own identification with filth occurs. Thus you became still pure, rose still higher. The thought that you might have given yourself similar advice before your marriage was to me utterly unthinkable. So there was hardly any smudge of earthly filth on you at all, and it was you who pushed me down into this filth, just as though I were predestined to it, with a few frank words. And so, if the world consisted only of me and you, a notion I was much inclined to have, then this purity of the world came to an end with you, and by virtue of your advice, the filth began with me. Again, it is here that Kafka cheats. It is not his father's, but his own desperate striving to keep the father pure. It is for Kafka himself that any notion of his father following similar advice, and consequently dwelling in filth, is utterly unthinkable, which means totally catastrophic, foreclosed from his universe. There follows a weird but crucial conclusion. The father's prosopopoeia. In his father's reply, as imagined by Kafka, the father imputes to Kafka that whatever he would have done, namely to support or oppose Kafka's marriage plans, it would have backfired and have been twisted by Kafka into an obstacle. The father evokes here the standard logic of paternal prohibition and its transgression. My aversion to your marriage would not have prevented it. On the contrary, it would have been an added incentive for you to marry the girl, for it would have made the attempt at escape, as you put it, complete. One has to be very precise here and avoid confusing this entanglement of the law and its transgression, the law sustained by a hidden call for its own transgression, with the superego proper as its almost symmetrically opposite. On the one hand, it is the hidden, non-articulated injunction, enjoy, violate the law, that reverberates in the explicit prohibition. On the other, much more interesting and uneasy hand, it is the hidden, non-articulated injunction to fail that reverberates in the explicit permissive call, be free, enjoy. The last paragraph does break the vicious cycle of mutual accusations and is thus hesitantly optimistic, opening up a minimal space of truce and a symbolic pact. My answer to this is that, after all, this whole rejoinder, which can partly also be turned against you, does not come from you, but from me. Not even your mistrust of others is as great as my self-mistrust, which you have bred in me. I do not deny a certain justification for this rejoinder, which, in itself, contributes new material to the characterization of our relationship. Naturally, things cannot in reality fit together the way the evidence does in my letter. Life is more than a Chinese puzzle. But with the correction made by this rejoinder, a correction I neither can nor will elaborate in detail, in my opinion, something has been achieved which so closely approximates the truth that it might reassure us both a little and make our living and our dying easier. What we have here is effectively a kind of self-analysis punctuated by the father's, analyst's, imagined intervention, which brings about the conclusion. It is as if Kafka's long, rambling flow finally provokes the analyst's intervention, as a reaction to which Kafka, the analysand, finally enacts the shift in his subjective position, signaled by the obvious but no less odd claim that this whole rejoinder, which can partly also be turned against you, does not come from you but from me. The parallel is clear with the conclusion of the parable on the door of the law, when the man from the country is told that this door was here only for you. Here, too, Kafka learns that all the spectacle of father's outbursts, and so forth, was here only for him. Thus, the letter to father did indeed arrive at its destination, because the true addressee was the writer himself. In this way, Kafka's subjective identification shifts, minimally, but in a way which changes everything, from the almost nothing of being father's filth to nothing at all. If all of it comes from me, my nullity can no longer be the other's filth. The move that concludes the letter is thus the one from death to sublimation, Kafka's choice of nothing as one's place, the reduction of his existence to the minimum where nothing but the place takes place, to paraphrase Mallarmé, creates the space for creative sublimation, literature. To paraphrase yet again Brecht's motto from the Threepenny Opera, what is the filth of engaging in small sexual transgressions compared to the filthy purity of writing, of literature as litterateur, Lacan's pun, as the litter defiling the surface of the earth?